Why do people who do bad things so often find ways to justify their behavior? Why do they sometimes go even further, turning the people they've harmed into villains, shifting blame, and painting themselves as the true victims? It's one of the most unsettling aspects of human psychology. The ability to rationalize harm and twist narratives until they serve the perpetrator's conscience. To understand this, we must dive deep into the mechanisms of self-deception, moral disengagement, cognitive dissonance, and the strategies people use to protect their sense of self when they act in ways that contradict morality. At the heart of this phenomenon lies the human need to see ourselves as good. Very few people wake up in the morning thinking, "I'm the villain in today's story." Most of us believe we are decent, even moral. When our actions violate those values, it creates a painful clash known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort we feel when our behavior doesn't align with our self-image. To relieve that discomfort, we adjust something. But instead of changing the harmful behavior, many people adjust the story they tell themselves. They justify, rationalize, and reframe their actions in ways that let them maintain the illusion of being good while continuing to do harm. Albert Bandura, the psychologist who developed social learning theory, described this process as moral disengagement. Moral disengagement is when people deactivate their moral standards to engage in harmful behavior without feeling guilt. Bandura identified mechanisms of moral disengagement such as euphemistic labeling, advantageous comparison, displacement of responsibility, and victim blaming. Each one acts like a psychological shield, protecting the person from guilt or shame. Take euphemistic labeling. Instead of calling something what it is, people soften the language. A cruel act might be described as tough love, exploitation reframed as just business, or harassment dismissed as just joking. The choice of words blurs moral clarity. By changing labels, people reduce the emotional weight of their actions. Language becomes a tool of justification. Advantageous comparison is another strategy. A person compares their behavior to something worse, making their own actions seem less bad. A corrupt politician might say, "At least I'm not as bad as that other guy who stole millions." A person who cheats in a relationship may think, "Well, at least I didn't hit them." By comparing themselves to worse scenarios, they paint their actions as relatively harmless. Displacement of responsibility is common when people feel pressure from authority. History is filled with examples where individuals said, "I was just following orders." This shifts the blame away from the self and onto a larger system or superior. It allows individuals to see themselves as instruments rather than moral agents. But perhaps the most insidious form of justification is victim blaming. This is when the perpetrator reframes the victim as deserving of the harm. Victim blaming takes many forms. A thief might say, "They shouldn't have left their car unlocked." An abuser might say, "They provoked me." A manipulator might insist, "They were naive. It's their fault for trusting me." By painting the victim as careless, deserving, or even malicious, perpetrators free themselves from guilt. If the victim is at fault, then the perpetrator becomes justified. Victim blaming also works to protect the worldview of bystanders. Believing that victims bring harm upon themselves allows outsiders to feel safer. It creates the illusion of control. If I don't make the same mistakes, it won't happen to me. This is known as the just world hypothesis, the belief that people get what they deserve. The just world hypothesis comforts us by making the world seem fair, but it also fuels cruelty toward victims, because people would rather believe victims deserve their fate than accept the randomness of injustice. People who do bad things also rationalize through dehumanization. Dehumanization strips the victim of individuality, dignity, or humanity. Once someone is seen as less than, harming, then becomes easier to justify. History is filled with tragic examples, propaganda that describe groups as animals, vermin, or objects. On a smaller scale, bullies in schools may refer to their victims with cruel nicknames that strip them of identity. By dehumanizing others, perpetrators reduce empathy and mute their conscience. Projection is another psychological defense. This is when perpetrators project their own flaws onto others. An unfaithful partner might accuse their spouse of cheating. A corrupt leader might accuse critics of dishonesty. By projecting their flaws onto others, they shift focus away from themselves and vilify their target. This not only protects their self-image, but actively reframes them as righteous. They become the defender of morality, while the victim becomes the alleged offender. Sometimes people justify harm by appealing to higher purposes. They claim that what they did was necessary for the greater good. A parent who is overly harsh may say, "I did it to teach them discipline." A company that exploits workers may insist, "We're creating jobs and boosting the economy." These justifications place harm in the context of a noble cause, which reframes cruelty as sacrifice. There's also diffusion of responsibility. When harm is carried out by a group, individuals feel less personally accountable. In mob behavior, each person feels that responsibility is diluted. "Everyone was doing it" becomes the refrain. This psychological trick reduces guilt because the self is absorbed into the collective. People also turn to denial and minimization. They deny the harm happened at all, or they minimize its impact. "It was just a joke." "They're overreacting." "It wasn't that serious." These phrases dismiss the victim's pain while preserving the perpetrator's image. Minimization is particularly common in interpersonal conflicts. By downplaying the harm, perpetrators convince themselves it doesn't require accountability. Self-serving bias also plays a role. Humans naturally attribute successes to internal qualities and failures to external circumstances. Perpetrators extend this bias to moral behavior. When they do something good, it's proof of their character. When they do something bad, it's because of circumstances. "I had no choice. I was under stress. Anyone would have done the same." This framing keeps the self-image intact. From a neurological perspective, the brain is wired to reduce cognitive dissonance quickly. When actions conflict with values, the brain seeks resolution. Rationalization provides that resolution. This means justifying harm is not always a conscious act. Sometimes it's automatic, a defense mechanism firing to protect the ego. The person may truly believe their rationalizations, even when they are objectively false. Cultural narratives reinforce these justifications. In some cultures, power is revered. When the powerful harm others, it is framed as strength rather than cruelty. In others, individual responsibility is emphasized so strongly that victims are always suspected of negligence. These cultural scripts provide ready-made justifications for perpetrators to adopt. Victim vilification is also fueled by fear. Admitting guilt means admitting vulnerability because it exposes the perpetrator to consequences and self-condemnation. By vilifying the victim, perpetrators shift attention away from themselves and onto their target. It's a psychological sleight of hand. If the victim is bad, then the perpetrator can continue to see themselves as good. We also see the role of ideology. Harm is often justified when framed within an ideological battle. Perpetrators may believe that they are defending tradition, religion, or justice. Violence or cruelty becomes excusable when framed as part of a righteous cause. This ideological framing turns victims into enemies of the cause, deserving of harm. The cycle of justification and vilification is reinforced socially. When peers, institutions, or media echo these justifications, they gain legitimacy. A bully who is laughed at by peers feels validated. A corrupt leader who is defended by allies feels justified. Social reinforcement makes it easier to maintain distorted narratives without self-doubt.